Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Event Management Journal podcast. I'm James Cannell, and I'm here with my co-host, Alan File. Hi, Alan.
Morning, everyone. Morning, Richard. Morning, James.
Morning.
And we're joined today by Dr. Richard Shipway, who's going to be talking to us about his latest paper published in Event Management with his co-author Zoe Barrett, and it's called Crisis Management Response Strategies of Small-Scale Sport Event Organisations to the Effect of the COVID-19 Pandemic. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, no worries. Hello, everyone.
So what we like to do at the beginning is just give you a chance to get your vocal cords going and say hello to the people who are watching or listening today. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, what you're working on at the moment, and what maybe a bit about the background to your paper?
Yeah, no worries. I guess I'm currently an associate professor in sport event management at Bournemouth University, where I've been for over 20 years now.
Wow.
In terms of, I mean, where do the years go? I mean, Alan and I had both had hair when we started working there, but that's the story. I mean, I came to sports events through, I previously worked at Sheffield University in the Sports Industries Research Centre. So going back to 2000, that must be where we did sort of economic and social impact studies, sports events for various local authorities. So that was my foray into sports events. And then obviously moving to Bournemouth, my area of research, which I still focus on quite a lot, is sport event impacts, sport tourism, and obviously a big part of sport tourism is the event dimension, which comes with it. I look at other things like innovation in sport, sport ethnography, and I guess one of the areas I focused on in about 2019 was crisis and disaster management. So at that time, everyone was sort of saying, what's that bit niche in it, crisis disaster management? Why do we need to study that in the sport, tourism, event and hospitality area? And then obviously COVID hit, and then it was the buzz thing. And then you're getting all these special issues and everyone publishing on COVID. And the timing was just very good. And we had, in your journal, in the event management, we had a couple of papers published in 2000, which were looking at, exploring crisis and disaster management. And I guess the issue was it was very much focused on large-scale mega sports events, how they cope with crisis and disasters. And there was nothing really which looked at small-scale sports events and how they were able to deal with some of the challenges and issues linked to a crisis or a disaster when it hits. So that was the impetus for the paper, was to focus on looking more at a local sports event and how, or event organisations, and how they manage a crisis or a disaster. And I guess we could discuss what the difference is between a crisis and a disaster. I guess the simplest way to look at it is a crisis is something which is often self-inflicted, but is something which will happen, whereas a disaster is something which you don't really have any control over. So that, we could look at the various concepts which are linked to, associated with this: crisis management, disaster management, risk management, resilience. But we kind
because you talk about that in the paper, don't you? That COVID started as a disaster and turned into a crisis. Was that the way round that it was in the paper?
Yeah, exactly. Because it was the uncontrollable, isn't it? How do you manage it? And it's really how organisations were able to put, it was basically thinking on our feet, wasn't it, in terms of something which hadn't happened, and to plan to look at resilience, isn't it? It's how can the disaster management and crisis management literature talks about recoiling, bouncing back, and all those cliches out there about bouncing back better. I think
revenge tourism.
That was the title of one of our papers, I think. But it's a reality, isn't it? In terms of it's looking at that. And what we found in the early work we did in the context of big mega events was that they were very large, very bureaucratic. And the reality that we found was that in this paper was that smaller organisations had that agility, that they could actually act quickly, respond quickly, and maybe adapt to crisis in a way that mega events couldn't.
Yeah, because that's the first time I remember reading your work was around around 2012, sort of before London 2012 and the Olympics, and then the work that you did around then. But I think there's so much in not just in our journal, but in so many of the events journals. There's so much about mega events.
Yeah, Richard, can I jump in, because it's interesting?
Yeah.
Because you're going back to 2012 there, James. Richard, you mentioned you were doing stuff in 2000. Did any of that early work prepare you and others, I guess, for COVID? So there's all, I can look at the tourism literature, and actually, although it's very, very interesting, it didn't really prepare anybody for what came. Was events different?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the big point, isn't it? In terms of, if you look at people define events, say, oh, we judge a mega event by this or this and this. No one factors in any sort of resilience or robustness behind them, even with the allocations of where events and go to. I mean, we know it tends to be a journey around Western cities and that, but you look at LA moving forward. I mean, well, I'm not going to talk about the political crisis that's going on there, but you could talk about crisis disasters. You've got the bushfires in California, about where the mountain bike trails are. You've got the San Andreas fault. Now, I'm not being a doom merchant, but there's a lot of these sort of things when they plan for robustness and resilience of mega sports events, and there's never any mention of that. It's all about, as we know, what's going to be the economic impact, what's going to be the business development aspects, what's going to be the community cultural impact, sports participation, but no one looks at the logistics of, well, what happens? And at the time we were doing all that work in 2012, everyone, it was all this, oh, it will never happen, nothing's gonna, there's challenges. But I mean, you look at the case studies we've had recently with the Rugby World Cup in Japan with Typhoon Hagibis and terrorist attacks at the Boston Marathon, and so you do look at this. And what we kind of argued in the papers that we've looked at since 2012, Al, is that when you look at mega events, the reality is the bigger they are and they're hosted in one city for a month or so, that doesn't necessarily mean they've got the expertise to deal with that. You could argue that a smaller scale event has a more resilience and can deal with crisis better because it's hosted every year in the same place with the same people. And then you're going across into all the knowledge transfer literature, because I'll tell you what, there's not much information passed from Beijing to London to Rio to Tokyo to Paris. So we kind of argued previously, and we've tried to allude to it in this paper, that maybe a smaller event, an organisation has an ability to manage crises better than a one-off mega sports event.
Yeah. It's quite interesting, actually, because I know this isn't a tourism conversation, but if I think what happened around here, Disney really struggled with COVID, but many of the smaller parks, they actually did quite well. So it begs the question, do you actually get too big with some of these things?
But they have, didn't they? If you're a small organisation, you've got no choice. I mean, we had the situation here in the UK where we had I don't know what it's like globally for your listeners, but we had the furlough scheme where we could all sit at home and do whatever. You were an event organiser. The event and hospitality, I don't know about hospitality, but the events industry didn't get any furlough support. So it was a case of, we've got to be innovative. We've got to be entrepreneurial, which is another discussion. Because if we don't have a business, because we're not getting the government bailouts. So, big isn't necessarily better. Small certainly has challenges, but it also has opportunities. I mean, that's what we found when we were doing our interviews.
It's quite funny watching the news this morning. If you're watching the news from Paris, virtually every French farmer and tractor is on its way to Paris. So yeah, good luck in the summer.
It does make you think about it moving forward, because they're talking now at the moment about what's going to be happening in the coming months. But how much, you go back to Paris in 2013 with the Bataclan bombings, the football attack at the Stade de France, and in the hospitality venues there. That's Paris is. Anyway, I don't want to get into that, but in terms of the cost involved with that, it's going to be significant. But resilient, I mean, this is what, if I was going to say what was our study about, it was really looking at it's how can small organisations become more resilient. And I think that underpins everything we've been looking at now. And it takes the events audiences into different spheres, doesn't it? In terms of, I've looked at crisis and disaster management, and a lot of that is embedded in the resilience literature in terms of how do you cope, planning, preparation. So those were the themes which came out, 3 things really: planning, preparedness and resilience. And I guess what I'm probably jumping ahead, but what I'd sort of say is this was embedded in the context of sports events. But there's so many other event settings that this could be explored in terms of some of these issues which we've uncovered outside the sports spheres, in terms of other forms of events which have had challenges in the past, be it, stampedes at concerts or even events in Saudi with the Hajj and, all these sort of, challenges which exist.
Yeah. Can I jump into something? What does it change the nature of the person? Because a lot of resiliency is about the individual or the groups of individuals running these things. Do you need a slightly different type of person to cope with all this stuff than the traditional event manager, whatever that is?
You've got different degrees of resilience, haven't you? You've got individual resilience. You've also got community resilience. I mean, look at the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester, which was obviously more of a terrorist attack. But you saw community resilience emerging from these disasters with the Manchester B sign and all of those. So you've got different levels of resilience. I think so. Social resilience, individual resilience, community resilience can be developed.
I thought there was something really interesting. Well, a lot of really interesting things, but an interesting thing up your paper was this sort of more entrepreneurial orientation that people had to develop, and how entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial people maybe have a better chance of being resilient or can come up with more resilient responses.
Yeah, and I mean, I was going to allude to that later on when it was sort of areas of future scope to develop this, but I was fortunate enough to travel over to UCF and visit Alan and run a workshop on innovation management and entrepreneurship. And so there's so much overlap that small businesses had to be creative and be entrepreneurial in their behavior. And in many ways, they didn't face the bureaucracy, or they overcame the bureaucracy or had to overcome that. You think about some of these, in the UK, we've got the NHS where you can't, everything's so bureaucratic and slow. If you're in a small event management organisation, maybe you've got more scope to be entrepreneurial in your behaviours and innovative in your practices. So that's a whole nother area of research, which I'll probably allude to later on when I talk about some of the stuff which have been done in your journal, which show that overlap between innovation, entrepreneurship, and how these small events were able to do that. Because that was one of the three main key themes which emerged from our data was, fostering entrepreneurial behaviours and people being more innovative, because they had to do it. They didn't have any choice, because it was, they could throw away the rules, regulations to a certain extent, maybe not to the extent our government did over here, but you had to be sorry, I shouldn't say that, but they had to be more creative. I think that's what I'm trying to allude to, James.
Yeah. No, and I'd say it makes sense. Did that surprise you? Or, what element of your findings served as a little bit of a shock? Like, oh, wow, I never expected that.
Yeah, and I mean, the biggest one is we talk about, building back better. For me, the thing which shocked me was it was more about survival. It's, these businesses about survival. It's not about, how can you do that? It's can you actually get through this? And what surprised me is, which really surprised me is, out the businesses we interviewed, yes, they were talking about being innovative and creative, but even now, 2 years later, I think 2 or 3 of them are struggling to survive. So, that's the reality of it. And Zoe, my co-author, won't mind me saying, but she was part of one of these organisations, was interviewing all these people. And now she's taken a break from the events industry and is working in another sector because it hasn't quite gone back to the level that it has before. So that I wouldn't say it surprised me, but it sort of shocked me. If we're looking at what's the future of the event sector and event managers and event organisers, it's a case of, are half of them still here? And we had that scenario in the UK, didn't we? Had all the support was going to certain sectors, as I said. But if you were to take in areas which all three of us are interested in terms of association football, where you've got spectator-based sports, where the fans aren't coming through the gates in terms of event spectators, you haven't got the revenue coming in. So a lot of these clubs now we're seeing are going to the wall or struggling financially because to get through it. So I guess in answer to your question, Al, I'm not surprised. I'm more shocked by that was the fact that, some of the businesses that we interviewed are no longer in existence.
It's quite
And
interesting because it's not a word that you read about much, but you read about resilience and all this stuff. But actually, it's survival.
Yeah, yeah.
And how do you pivot to survive?
Yeah.
And it's not just that sense, is it? Of there's a crisis and there's a shake, like an economic crisis and a shakeout, and some firms go to the wall, but then you get the innovators come through and new businesses, and that's not like you said, for participatory sports and for sports with for events with audiences. If there's a change in participation,
There's an
then
interest.
actually there is no market for anyone to come along and exploit afterwards.
No, there's an interesting concept in the disaster management literature and crisis literature, which talks about cascading disasters and cascading crisis. And there's a really strong body of literature on this. It's called Cascading Disasters, and I've written a bit about this in the events field. It's sort of one event will lead to another event, which will lead to another event, and now it's like a toppling dominoes effect where leads to another, and a lot of these businesses didn't survive, but what I'd say more positively is if you think about it from our area in terms of events or even tourism or sport, you could say that it forced a lot of these event organisations to be more to maybe fast track things they might have done but weren't ready to do. So I can give examples. It would probably be diversification of what you offer, and the big one, obviously, for all sectors is digitalisation, isn't it? In terms of offering something. Because you had to, and we could all talk about. We all did our online Zoom exercise classes, or people signed up for Peloton for two months, or did all that sort of stuff, and then went back to hanging their clothes off of the back of the bike. But that's the reality of it. Is we saw that digitalization even, and I've covered this in work we've done with the theatre sector, where the theatres, up in London, introduced things where even online bookings, having your food delivered to your seat in theatres, all the sort of things which were going to happen, but they had to happen because of a crisis. So crisis does provide opportunities, as you're saying, James, for innovation and entrepreneurial behaviour.
And there's some lovely, rich
example, but I'm sure Britain's the same as here, where many restaurants now have permanent drive-by pickup. But that's where they make the money now. It's crazy.
I'll ask you guys a question. If we could go back to all this Pine and Gilmore experience economy stuff from the 90s and sort of stuff, but what do you really want? Okay, this digitalization for the events industry is good, but it's only part of the product. We want experience. We know that. We experienced that. So that message came out in one of our other themes, was this customer-focused approach, real authentic experiences. So it's not reinventing the wheel, but it's, at the end of the day, digitalization, in my opinion, complements what we do, but we really want those shared experiences authentic, and that's going back to 20 years or so, isn't it? So, but that a lot of what we saw in our study came out of managing crisis.
So what next? Where do we go next with your research? What you talked about, the kind of the three big areas in your model, but what kind of research needs to follow up on this and take it further?
I think that there's a lot of work to be done, maybe sort of in Alan's field to a certain extent, in terms of crisis communication, about how you put something in place in terms of culpability and liability, and how you when your crisis happens, how you protect the image of your destination or of your sport event when it's affected by crisis. That's an interesting one. Just because there's yet again in the crisis literature, there's a lot of stuff on blame management. When anything, Delhi, the Commonwealth Games in 2010 is a good example of that, or when things go wrong, and how, when you have a crisis, how you deal and cope with that crisis, is a big one. And I still think there's too much emphasis presently on the mega large scale sports events. But we segmented it saying mega large annual events in the middle one, but it's these community grassroots based events of how they cope with crisis, how they've. So that was kind of what we were trying to kickstart here, is some sort of discussion about looking at the future, of manage for more smaller community based sports events.
And there's real richness in it's a pleasure to read such qualitative work and to hear so many of your respondents talking through this paper. There's such real richness around the things that they've had to do. When you're talking about blame management, there's a great bit where someone's talking about organising a triathlon and having to worry about, okay, well, we're going to put 400 people together and get them to run through the streets of the city or whatever it was. How are other people going to think about that? Is that how are we going to manage our reputation at a time when a crisis is happening? That kind of detail, I think, is just fantastic.
I mean, do you know what, James? It's interesting because the backstory, Richard knows better than me, but when he was doing his PhD, there was a whole group. Was it, what was the professor's name? Was it Holloway?
Yeah, Amy Holloway. Holloway,
yeah. There was a whole thrust of qualitative research coming into Bournemouth, and it was at the time it's not proper research, but it was really, really well done. And we used to do a lot with the health school, and you appreciate the richness because the majority of papers aren't quantitative. So when you delve into stuff, it's really, really interesting, and I think you find far more.
Well,
it was a good stage.
Your competitor, well, it's not your competitor, but the second most significant, in my opinion, event journal would be the International Journal of Event and Festival Management. And I'm on the editorial board of that. And the first edition we wrote was a qualitative piece called Meaning Not Measurement, which was basically that very point that Alan's making there. And I haven't got anywhere near as many citations as the most esteemed colleagues here, like Professor File, but we get citations on that in terms of uncovering that richness, the meaning, not the measurement behind that. And I was always given, and for any of your listeners, what I'd say is these three magic words when you're doing qualitative research is data takes primacy. Be led by the data and the richness that goes with it. And those three words will probably be ingrained in my brain from my PhD. And I think that's a good learning process, really, for all sort of PhD students or early career researchers is to be more diverse. So I think there's been a massive increase in qualitative research within the events field, and it's richer for it. No pun intended.
No, I agree. And in many cases, you've probably answered the question I was going to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So if you're a new researcher now, there's lots of opportunities, but the environment's quite challenging for multiple reasons. What advice would you give an emerging new scholar, really, in the field of events? What advice would you give them?
Well, based on my experiences, probably 2 points. I'll probably say, focus on getting your PhD done. All these exciting things. Get the end goal. Don't go off on a.
We all suffered from that.
Good advice. Yeah.
Some of his past students, where you just kind of rein them in. They're going, all these exciting and wonderful things. They go off here, there, and everywhere, and teaching and supervision and all this other exciting things, and then they don't. It takes them 4 years plus rather than the 3 years, etc., etc. So focus would be the first one. I think the second and the most important one is networking. I mean, I worked internally at Bournemouth with Alan, but my best networks, no offence, Al, but my best networks are externally through work I did in this field, attending conferences and networking with people in the events sphere like Leo Jago and other colleagues in that area, Jack Carlson and others, but also, Brent Ritchie at UQ, all the people that I've published with. And it's open doors. And more importantly, for ECRs and PhD students, it's friendship as well and networks, people you're on. So, and I think there's a conflict there in the UK in terms of where we're struggling to finance conference attendance and stuff like that. And all you go to conferences. And I get that we've got so many people who've benefited from
everything. Yeah.
So I would say focus being the first and networking being the second one.
No.
Great advice.
I agree. Great advice. And it's funny, the economic sort of savings being made at the moment, it will be very detrimental 5-10 years down the line. Because you're right, in those early years, you need to get out.
I mean, your conference, Al, the one that you had, the wonderful UCF conference, the hospitality one that Raymond organised. Hardly any.
No, the Brits don't come anymore.
No. Finance is one thing, but it's a institutional thing about budgets, and it's
Mind you, it's interesting that you mentioned all your network were Australian, so it's obviously had nothing to do with getting cheap flights to Australia over the years. But there you go, just a connection there.
Yeah.
We've got one question that we like to ask at the end of every show, which is to say if you've got something you'd like to recommend for our viewers, our listeners to have a read of. It can be something from the journal or something, just could be anything you want, but just something that might spur their imagination and make them want to read a bit more.
I guess James, you alluded to the point about entrepreneurship and innovation being a result of crisis, and I think really I read recently there was a special issue within your journal, Event Management. I think was it Vanessa Ratton did something on
Vanessa, yeah.
I think really it might be interesting if some of your readers or your listeners went and had a look at that special issue and looked at what was happening in the entrepreneurship and innovation management field as well, because there's quite a diverse range there. I mean, we did an article in there looking at sustainable entrepreneurship and stuff like that. So I would say multiple articles in that special issue might be quite recent, and it overlaps with a lot of the impact of COVID. So maybe that special issue would be a good one to read from your journal.
Great, and we had Vanessa on the first podcast that we did.
Here's the
as well,
first
so
one.
we can put a link in the show notes to that podcast where she talks about that special issue as well. That'd be fantastic. Thanks for that. I just want to say thank you for your time. We really appreciate that today. Thanks to all our listeners and our viewers for sticking with us through these podcasts. We're quite a few in now, and it's been a real privilege to be able to talk about research and try and make some of the research in the journal a bit more accessible to people. So thank you very much for your time, Richard.
Okay.
Thanks, Richard.
Okay,
Good job, sir.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.